Senator Johnson raised the question of entitlement spending as a percentage of our total budget. It is the majority. By one measure, it's 56%. By one measure, it's 64%. But it's clearly the majority of our entire federal spending. As a constitutional scholar, what portion, what programs that we now call entitlement spending are part of the enumerated powers of Article 1, Section 8?
There are those who will tell you that those are based on the spending clause in Clause 1 of Article 1, Section 8. That was the justification advanced at the time these programs were created, and it rested on an expansive interpretation provided by the Supreme Court saying, in essence, Congress can spend anything it wants as long as it has tax revenues coming in, or as it turns out, even if it doesn't, it can spend it on whatever it wants. This can't be reconciled with the original understanding of the clause. If you go back to founding era documents, the discussions around the state ratification debates, the Federalist Papers, they understood the spending clause as being there so that Congress would have the power to spend money on those powers that were duly enumerated. So under the Articles of Confederation, for example, they had the power to create an army, but no power to raise revenue and spend money on it. This fixed that problem. But it wasn't supposed to upend everything. It wasn't supposed to say Congress can literally do everything. If these kinds of programs were to come forward and we were really following the original understanding of the Constitution, we'd say, let's do these at the state level and the local level, never at the federal level.
Thank you. If entitlement spending is the majority of our federal budget, we clearly cannot address a 40% budget deficit while ignoring a 50% cost factor. How can entitlement reform be enacted that does not become politically suicidal? Because each government program has its own constituency. How can we address the entitlement matter in such a way that it is not politically self-extinguishing?
That's a great question. I mean, you saw Republicans in the House last year put forth a very bold proposal that addressed a lot of these issues, and the other side wanted to use that in their political favor, so to speak. I think, in my opinion, is the American people need to be the ones that are pushing. This needs to come from the grassroots, putting the pressure on members of Congress and on the Senate to say, we know the problem needs to be fixed, and let's address it now and get the political gamesmanship out of the way.
So how do you develop the constituency for fiscal responsibility? Is a balanced budget amendment that puts a fixed ceiling as a percentage of our economy the only way to enforce that discipline? Is it a necessary precondition to addressing our deficit problem?
You know, Colin, I think if we ever are going to fix the problem, it really is this two-step process. And the first one is we have to fight the fight, and we have to establish those very hard fiscal disciplines. And a constitutional amendment, certainly one to limit the size of government in relation to GDP, is one of the first steps. But there are other things we need to do as well. In the 60s, 68% of the budget was actually on budget. It was actually appropriated. That's flipped. Last year, only 38% of the budget was actually appropriated. Everything else was on automatic pilot, out of control. And 10 years from now, that number is slated to be 73%. So we need to put all these programs on budget. We need to put hard spending caps in the Constitution to force everybody to the table to negotiate in good faith. That is not what happened. Certainly the President did not negotiate in good faith with us last year.
And how can you be on budget if your Senate Majority Leader won't even bring a budget to the floor of the United States Senate?
That is a national scandal. That is a national scandal.
I don't think the American public fully appreciates that point. Our budget is out of control because, in effect, our budget doesn't exist. And how can we be expected to spend responsibly if, in fact, we have no budget at all? I'd like to expand this question of entitlements, however, since that's such a large part of it. Would you agree that there's an entitlement mentality, which is kind of a necessary precondition to entitlement reform? How do we change the entitlement mentality? How do we restore, as a matter of civic leadership, how do we restore concepts of personal responsibility, individual accomplishment, and that kind of constraint, why wouldn't we say that the entitlement, the fundamental entitlement of the United States Constitution is an entitlement to liberty, not to programs? So how do we go about doing that from a leadership standpoint? Each of the three of you has, in fact, taken on that issue in the public forum. Just quickly summarize in our waning few moments here how you think that the people in this room, the enormous, powerful, committed, conservative activists that make up CPAC, can be part of this team, this effort to change the American perception of entitlements as a frame of mind, as a frame of reference. Let's begin with you, Senator Lee.
You know, I tend to think that the first step involves helping people understand that what we have right now just isn't sustainable. Right now, we're spending between $200 and $250 billion a year in interest on our debt. By the end of this decade, I actually predict it'll come sooner than that. We'll be paying closer to $1 trillion a year just in interest on our debt. Now, that difference of close to $800 billion a year, it's more than we spend on Social Security in a year. It's about what we spend on Medicare and Medicaid combined. It's going to have to come from somewhere, even as our entitlement obligations are increasing, not decreasing. So if we help people understand what has been established, it is not sustainable. It's not going to work, so we've got to come up with practical solutions to do it. And I think we have to start by limiting, as a percentage of GDP, what we can spend through the federal government. Once we get on that plane, then we can start having a serious conversation about how to shift a lot of these obligations back to the states where they belong and away from the federal government, which, by the way, has actually been a very poor steward of these very same programs. So
Amen.
even for people who like these programs, who want to preserve them, ought to be in favor of restricting our spending, because it's our spending and our deficit spending in particular that's threatening to destroy those very programs.
Colin, I'll add to that and say that for me, I believe it begins in the family. I believe that fathers need to be teaching their children not to count on the government to take care of them when they grow older. And so it may take a generation to change all of this, but if America's looking to Washington to be the example, they're looking at the wrong example. They need to be looking within the family.
Amen.
Well, Tom, you notice both, or Colin, you notice both Tom and Mike mentioned education and forming. And that really is, the bottom line is we have to win back the hearts and minds of America. We have to, because our education system has failed us. I mean, we don't teach how exceptional this country is anymore. We don't teach economics. Americans simply don't understand. So certainly one of the things I've been talking to business leaders about back in Wisconsin is, I was a business leader. I never imposed my politics on people who worked with me. Kind of like religion is off limits. We can't afford to take that approach anymore. So I'm begging owners of businesses to get their employees involved. And I'm asking everybody, talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors, total strangers. We have got to inform the American public. That is the key. We have to educate.
And that's a message of unity, as opposed to the message we're seeing outside this hotel, attempting to divide America into constituencies, to create envy on the 1 versus 99%. We need to pull together as a nation and look for mutual prosperity, mutual opportunity, not divide people, restore liberty to the thing that we're most entitled to, rather than handouts.
Absolutely.
Back in the summer when the budget issue was front and center, what did you have as 2 or 3 of your personal favorite targets, specific programs that you felt could be substantially reduced or eliminated entirely in order to whittle away at this $1 trillion deficit that we now have? Let's just go straight down the line.
Anything to do with a bailout, whether it's a bank bailout or an auto manufacturing bailout, has to go right out the door. I think agricultural subsidies.
Now, total those two up right now since this administration has come in.
Well, in the last 4 years, if we take it back over the last 4 years, it's in the trillions. I mean, it's probably in the $2.5 trillion range, somewhere in that area. Any kind of agricultural subsidy is something that we shouldn't be doing. We should get out of the U.S. Department of Education. The federal government has no business in that. That by itself, even a few years ago, before we bumped up spending, was around $50 billion a year. Now, $50 billion unfortunately feels like a small drop in the bucket when compared to our overall budget and our overall debt, but it's a start. Well, we've got to get out of the business of Washington doing things that Washington has no business doing, because that's not our job.
Well, as we dealt with the debate in the House, I was, of course, I'm on the Appropriations Committee, which is a very interesting spot for me to be on the committee. But we looked for just where was waste. Great example was a Tijuana sewer plant that we, as Americans, were funding a rehabilitation project. To emphasize, that is the kind of wasteful spending that's going on in Washington. In addition to the ethanol subsidies and many of the other subsidies of corporate welfare, all those things we were targeting. But when you get into those individual debates about programs specific, that's when it gets difficult and everybody's all over the place on votes. That's why cut, cap, and balance was so important, because it just set the parameters.
Absolutely.
It put the box in place and said, fit the government in the box. Whatever you can get in it, and then fight about it later what gets in the box. And that's why I hope we continue to press forward on that, because it defines what we should all be about in Washington.
Can't do it without limits, that's right.
Tom, there's no shortage of good ideas. I mean, dating back to the Grace Commission, I'm old enough to know that. I mean, the Grace Commission, Simpson Bowles, Tom Coburn's Back in Black. The GAO has done one study, about ready to release another study, showing duplicated programs save $200 to $300 billion a year. And when the super committee was first started up operations, I had my staff go through those old studies, and within a week, we identified $1.4 trillion worth of savings. Things like freezing hiring, reducing the workforce through attrition. There are tons of really good ideas that save hundreds of billions of dollars. We just don't have the political will here in Washington to actually start implementing those suggestions.
Amen. Well, there are some resources that I would encourage you in the audience to make yourselves aware of, in addition to the websites of our three wonderful presenters here today. I want to identify two of them. One is Joe Ricketts and Brian Baker's endingspending.com. Go to that site. Joseph Farah has one called nomoreredink.com. And each of these three legislative leaders has been in the forefront of fixing this enormous problem. Please join with me in a hearty CPAC thank you to our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. Great.